like to reintroduce Wendy Klemperer and just say how delighted I am that you're here today and that I'm able to review Wendy's and my past a little bit. You know, we've really done some great projects together over the
We
years.
sure have.
And very fortunately, I had a show at the Maine Audubon Society that had a whole herd of deer by Wendy Klemperer. And I try to market the work that I have in these different shows, and I was going to the Portland Jetport on the Jetport Boulevard, and I could just picture those deer on that hillside. And I went to the director of the Portland Jetport, Paul Bradbury, and he said, "Oh, June, great idea, but we don't have any money to purchase something like that. You find someone that will purchase those pieces, and I'll help you put them there." And that's what I did. I went to one of my big patrons, William Hamill, and he very generously purchased elk, deer, a wolf, and we commissioned Wendy to do the porcupine. We also did another project where we were putting an osprey on the bridge between Falmouth and Portland, and we were working with this great team of people, but we wanted to position the osprey just right. And Wendy was truly up on this cherry picker scaffolding box and being swiveled over.
That was so fun. It was like 20 feet in the air, or at least.
Well, this is Wendy's summer studio, and her other studio is in Brooklyn, New York. And we claim her as a New England artist because of this studio.
I grew up in the Boston area, in Cambridge and Watertown, and I think, when I was maybe 3 or 4 or something, we started coming up here for the summer. Part of my love of nature and animals came from being in this place, and it's very deep in me. Just spending the summers here and riding horses and chasing after frogs and snakes and just all that stuff that kids do. But when I went to art school in 1980, and I had this great period in New York, and I fell in love with New York, and I loved it. It was all rough and tumble back then, but it was wonderful. And so I was doing that. Then I had a residency at the MacDowell Colony in Peterborough, which is 20 minutes away from here. And I was suddenly like, wow, I have this here, and I was missing the country and everything after my time in New York. So anyways, that's what propelled me to start spending time up here in the summer and make artwork and kind of get fed by nature, be able to start riding horses again and stuff. So I started up this country life as well as the city life. So I would spend, for about 30 years now, I've been spending the winter in New York and then the summer and fall up here. I went to University of Rochester, then transferred to Harvard junior year, and then graduated from Harvard with a degree in biochemistry. But at the same time at Harvard, I had this amazing sculpture class that I had always been doing art and painting and drawing, but this sculpture class opened up this world of the process of making art, not so much like drawing a picture or something, but like the whole creative process, coming up with an idea from maybe a sketch and then making versions of it, making little maquettes. And then I learned about all these different sculpture processes, like carving wood, carving stone, casting, modeling in clay, casting in plaster, and then even a little bit of welding back then. And building on top of that with plaster. So I fell in love with sculpture then, decided to be an artist, but my parents thought I should finish the biochemistry degree, which I did. And so then right after that, I went to Pratt. I also think that the process of being an artist is, in many ways, it's like a scientist, because people think of them as being so different, but I think going into your studio every day and trying to make something happen is a lot like going into a laboratory and setting up your experiments. And, there's a lot of there's a kind of daily grind to it, but then you're also waiting for these moments to happen. And you set a process in motion, and then you like with sculpture, you almost create a problem for yourself, and then you, by starting something, and the minute you start something, then you react to it and you keep building or subtracting or whatever. And I think that it's a bit like the scientific process of having some problem you want to solve, and then you set up these experiments, figure out ways to test that problem. And then in my imagery and the images that I'm working with is the whole sort of biology. I think a lot about evolution, both in terms of how forms evolve and how there's one type of, there's DNA, and then there's a blueprint for life, and then there's a certain structure from mammals that all mammals have different versions of it, but we have, knees and ankles and toes. A horse has a hoof instead of toes, but I think about all that stuff when I'm making the work. So, and then I also think about environmental issues, as we all are more and more. It's all been there all the time. It's just that now people are it's finally coming to the forefront and finally being talked about. All that stuff has always been there. And I think that all those thoughts and issues have always been an element of my work, not maybe the absolute main focus. Like I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm an artist, but those ideas do go into the work. I don't have a exact story I'm trying to tell or message. I don't have a message I'm trying to give people. Sometimes when I've put the work together into a show, there's like when June Lacombe organized my one-person show at the Coastal Maine Botanical Garden. When you're pulling it all together, I think then you start looking at a theme or start trying to see what's happening at that time in the work. And at that time we realized that most of the work I was making were things like elk and wolves and lynx, and we were showing them in this Coastal Maine Botanical Garden, and we started realizing those animals don't actually exist in Maine anymore. And it made me think about and I am fascinated by evolution and also the idea of survival of the fittest also versus sort of pressures of human expansion. And so it made me think that those species, they're not extinct yet. The ones I was working with, they're not extinct, but they've been extirpated from a lot of parts of the United States. And that started to become the theme of the show, and we ended up calling it Reimagined. And it was this idea that I was bringing these animals back to this land that they had once existed in and reimagining them back in place. And I was working, the way I work, which is a lot of the times they were sort of a bit larger than life, and then they are also these forms that are solid and that substantial in that they're made out of metal, but they're also transparent. You can see through them. They're made up of all these lines that appear to still be moving, so they're almost like they're coming into being before your eyes or almost disappearing back into the landscape, which is sort of what wildlife can do. So this is sort of an intellectual layer that we put on top of the work that's true to the work, but I only knew it after the fact, is what I'm trying to say. I didn't come up with this idea beforehand, but in looking at the work, I started feeling like, oh yeah, it's like this piece is just emerging out of the landscape, and it's almost evoking this idea about something that once was and can still be, but might disappear. So you can add that sort of feeling to the work. I love the idea of actually being out in the world studying, lions and tigers and everything, but I haven't.
And bears.
And bears, yes. I'm actually doing that right now. Studying bears, you can see. I did a residency in Denali National Park, and I was there for just 2 weeks, but I had a little cabin all by myself in the middle of this giant place, and I could see bears, all these grizzly bears. And it was so fascinating because I really learned a lot about their behavior and their movement and all that stuff. And then I had a brief residency at a sculpture park in Portland, Oregon right after that, and that was when I made my first bear sculpture. And it really did help to be looking at the live animal and seeing, just not just, okay, it looks like this when it's moving, but just the behavior, the interaction, all that kind of stuff. It all goes in there. It's worked out. And of course, meeting Jude Lacombe in 2005 through a fellow sculptor who had shown with you, Joyce Audie Zarens.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, she was the one who said, "Oh, you should contact June. She might be interested in your work." And that was fantastic. From the first group show I was in way back then onward, it became an amazing, fruitful, wonderful partnership. And I'm super thankful to have been working with you for so long. It's really June actually is really responsible for transforming my life quite a bit. The silhouette idea actually happened a long time ago. I would go in my studio at night and notice the shadows that the sculptures cast. And there's something just so fascinating about the shadow. It's almost more evocative than the thing itself. That's when I started. I started out tracing the shadows way back then. It was much later that I revisited the idea of cutting them out. It's when I got a plasma cutter. That was the tool that made it possible. Because you could cut this out with a torch, but it would be much rougher looking. A plasma cutter is an electric arc tool that you can cut a very precise line in metal. And so I started doing these series of shadows. But I've been playing around with those silhouettes for quite a while, hanging them. And actually, when we go indoors, you'll see some other versions of silhouettes that are used with the plasma cutter. My interest in wild animals, and I was always drawn to very sort of the expression and exuberance and fierceness of a wild animal. And so a lot of my earlier welded metal work were these really aggressive hound-like creatures. I think also I really didn't want my work to be cute, and I really didn't want it. I was making animal art, but I didn't really want to be making animal art in that way. So I think that's also what led me to go for this really expressive, wild exuberance. I started out working with new metal that I would buy, but then very quickly I started realizing that I would see these piles of scrap metal, like at a construction site, just these piles of rebar, and there was just this attraction. It was like a scrambled tangle of branches, so I started collecting those and using that as my material. With the electric arc welder, I could very quickly take a few pieces and zap them together, and I would make almost like a little tripod structure as just a thing to build off of, and I could just zap, 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 and it could stand there. And if I needed to change it, I could just rip a piece off and redo it. I learned how to use an oxyacetylene torch, and then that really freed me up too, because then I could trim off, I could cut all these parts, I was already working with bent up shapes that were really interesting, but if it wasn't with the right bend, I could heat it and bend it. I always say that the work is really kind of like doing a gesture drawing in space in 3 dimensions. I'm doing the final installation this Friday, but I still haven't had a chance to. I wanted to bring these guys over and play around with them and figure it out, but I'm just going to figure it out the day of the installation.